At the end of the day, fraud prevention has to have a degree of resiliency or redundancy to be effective, right?
Hi everyone, Dan Holmes here from Feed's Eye. I'm delighted today to be joined by Stuart. Stuart, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Dan. It's nice to be here too. I'm a senior product director at FeedSci. I've had about 10 years of experience in the industry, mainly in fraud prevention systems and different vendors.
And you specialize in device intelligence, behavioral biometrics, anything that you can get from an end user
Yeah,
that's.
everything that we kind of bundle up is the concept of digital trust.
So I really want to use that as a foundation for today's discussion. As the markets evolve from a world where account takeover and third-party fraud risk was the key challenge that banks were having to prevent, we've come to a world where a lot of the fraud that happens now is a fraudster scamming a victim to make a transaction on their behalf. So you've kind of gone from this third party to this first party world in terms of the core attack vector. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot is that banks are saying, hey, look, these traditional enrichment capabilities that I've got, like device, like behavior, perhaps like malware, perhaps like location, and all these things that you've traditionally associated with a kind of strong fraud ecosystem, they're starting to question whether these are the right things to move forward with. And I guess an extension of that observation is that a bunch of technology providers that have traditionally specialized in perhaps one of those disciplines are now converging from a capability perspective. And I guess the question on the lips of a lot of the banks is, how do I kind of manage this moving world where the attack vector is shifting very quickly? The vendors that I'm using are converging in terms of capability very quickly. It feels like these two things are coming to a head, and we're perhaps due a big inflection point or some form of consolidation around what the banks opt to do. Is that something that you're thinking about as you kind of think about where you take your product? And is that an observation that you share within market? And how are banks thinking about this?
I think it's safe to say, if you look back at the last kind of 10 years or so, there's been a lot of, we could now say they're kind of point solutions in the market. So vendors that have necessarily specialized in device and tracking what the device looks like online to help make attestations around, okay, I've seen this device for Dan before, therefore I'm confident that seeing that device again, gives me strong reason to believe it's probably Dan returning on one of the devices he owns. That's then kind of moved on. There's been a lot of acquisitions in the market as well, traditionally by device players who've looked at behavioral biometrics as a natural extension. And the two complement each other. And definitely beyond that, threat as an additional series of signals complements that even further. I think what is really driving the market in that space is really, if I have this traditional approach where I've got multiple vendors, multiple point solutions, one, that's a lot of cost from an overhead perspective, from a licensing perspective. Two, that's a lot of overhead from a level of understanding. I'm having to interact with all these different platforms. And then three, how do you actually make sense if one vendor solution says, oh, this device looks bad, but another says this behavior looks good? What's meant to be your outcome in that? And that's kind of left to the customer to decide. So I definitely think this inflection point is more, how do I consolidate all these different signals? And, device traditionally could be used as much as a risk indicator as an identity indicator. Behavior can be used as an identity indicator and a risk indicator. So all these things, when you actually pull them together alongside other threat signals, is this maybe an automated attack? Is it, for example, a bot? Is it some example of a device I've seen before, but elements of it look tampered, which raise suspicion in the particular device identity? All these things, if they converge together in one unified platform, gives you the best insight into what's happening, gives you the strongest controls with regards to how you're able to pivot to new fraud MOs that might emerge, and definitely plays into giving you the overall best return in your fraud detection capabilities. By converging all these signals into one solution, you have a greater speed of reaction. And you also, and most importantly, you have the ability to trade off the kind of false positives, the amount of friction you put into the channel against the true positives, how much fraud you're wanting to detect at that particular fraud budget that you have in your organization.
I guess an extension of that is you could be using those capabilities you described, device, behavior, threat intel, etc., at different points of the user journey as well, right? So you could have some that operate at login, some that operate at the point of payment, which adds an additional layer of complexity to that overall value proving and what incremental benefit does the device feed give me in terms of my core fraud KPIs of detection, ability to resolve false positives, etc. And I don't think we've quite got to the stage in the market where banks have figured out the best way to perform properly with accuracy that level of quantification. So I think you're absolutely right. What we need to see is a move away from this way of working where we've got a bunch of, let's call them micro decisions throughout the journey. So a device decision, a behavior decision, a threat intel decision, a transaction decision. How do we bring that into a single infrastructure, a single risk engine, and use it as a macro a macro capability? When you do get to that stage, you've potentially then got the option within that risk engine to say, hey, well, I've got a machine learning model that aggregates all the intel, all the scores, all the insights from these providers. What happens to the model that sits in that risk engine if I remove any feature that relates to a device? What does that then do to the overall performance of the model? What happens if I remove any feature that's relative to behavior? What happens to the overall performance of the model? So you can hopefully get to a point where you're able to quantify that with more confidence, because if you determine that your model performance reduces by 1% as a result of having no device feed, you know as an institution what that 1% means in terms of fraud loss. How does that compare to your point, the contractual cost of that service, and do the two reconcile in terms of making sense?
At the end of the day, fraud prevention has to have a degree of resiliency or redundancy to be effective, right? Fraudsters equally want a return on their investment. If you remove a control because you're not seeing it adding value, that's perhaps equally indicative that fraudsters are not using that because the controls that have been in place have meant the return on investment from them trying to use those techniques is low. If you then remove those controls, the weakest link in your journey becomes the one that the fraudster will exploit. And they'll go, okay, I've removed a device tracking solution. I've removed browser fingerprinting, device fingerprinting because I see no uplift in my model. Well, actually, that in moving it, you're opening an attack vector to that sort of fraud. And creatures of habit, being a fraudster, I'll move to where the weakest link lies.
How do you see something like a device indicator evolving to better equip the bank to address that type of technology? So does it go beyond just a fingerprint to things like a rat detection? How's rat detection going to evolve? What about things like determining that the user's on the phone whilst they're making a transaction? Can you perhaps just talk us through how those signals have matured and why it's important that we continue to push down that path?
Yeah, I think overall there's been a number of movements in the market. Even if I just speak about device most immediately, what you could do from a device tracking perspective 12 years ago is markedly different than what you can do today. A lot of the academic papers that were written about device fingerprinting and the, I guess, moral panic about being able to track people online was born from the fact that it was the wild, wild west. You could detect all sorts of things through browsers and through operating systems to identify people online. What's happened in the last 5 years has more been a marked movement and commodification of privacy. So now everyone's been told by the operating systems and by browsers that the primary concern is to ensure their own privacy. The effect of that has been that some of these signals have waned in efficacy. Equally, you could argue, consumer habits these days and the way that, large mobile handsets, they all converge to have the same underlying hardware. So there's this homogeneous device population, which means that everyone's buying, for example, the latest and greatest Android device or the latest and greatest iPhone, and they all look quite similar. So those things have kind of come into play with regards to how device has had to adapt and evolve as a useful vector for trust and for risk analysis. And I think what the market's now kind of missing is understanding that concept of device as an extension of user behavior. So if you think about how I use my device today, I still need to understand it's a device. I still need to recognize it as a returning device. I need to associate it with myself, but I need to understand how that's used and the relationship it has. across contexts like time. My anecdote is every week on a Sunday, my wife tells me I've forgotten to pay the dog walker. So every week I use my particular device that's most convenient to me, which is my mobile device. I log in, I use that device to make a payment. Round about 8 p.m. is usually when I get told, and then I log out. So there's this definitely an extension, and I do that in my house. So this is extension of like my device has a behavior, it's driven by me, but it has a relationship to where I'm using it, what time of day I tend to use it from, and what networks I'm seeing on. And I think that that notion is sometimes kind of missed in the value of device as a broader spectrum of behaviors. And equally, beyond that, I think that device behavior has this ability to add a lot of value that just no one in the industry is talking about. We all talk about the device identity, using lists to manage the identity of a device. I'm going to deny this device, not let it abuse accounts. I'm going to trust this device based upon its identity. Well, actually, given what I've said, some of these concepts need to expand now to have a wider view of what a device is, again, based upon behavior, but also consider that it's not just about the identity, the kind of global identity of this particular device. It's also about scoring the similarity, the patterns of behavior of a device to me. Do they look similar? And I think when you come to it from that point of view, you realize how something that might be, again, going back to our point earlier, waning in efficacy has actually greater amounts of value just based upon how it's positioned as an overall market solution and how you think of it in the context of that wider data set. So converging all these signals together to give the most benefit, even in one particular area, such as device identity.
Yeah, so you're almost trying to, I guess, triangulate the device. So what device is the user using when they do their dog walker payments at Sunday on at 8 p.m. on a Sunday evening, with how they do it, which is kind of the traditional behavioral biometrics, the gyroscopics, the touch, the pressure, etc. But also add the extra pillar of I guess, the behavioral analytic component. Like, how does Stuart do that? What are the intricacies of that device in terms of things like the screen resolution, the brightness, all these additional things?
Absolutely. And, again, there's this extension of device and behavior together, right?
Yeah.
The way I behave is influenced by a device. The way I behave is influenced by a website design.
Yeah.
These things are inextricably linked. Like you can't separate them. And that's why you need to treat them as an overall data set that is telling you a narrative about an individual user. Everything kind of converges into how do I identify this user? Now, going back to your other point, social engineering, scams, prevalence. So in those situations, the notion of identity is proven. I know it's Dan, I know it's Stuart, based upon these patterns I see of user behavior. But then you have to look at the indicators of risk that, as much as I might be confident this is Dan, there's maybe anomalous behaviors which indicate particular qualities in how you're behaving. Maybe the amount of time you're spending in a session is very long. It's an indication that you're being passed information in another channel. Maybe a fraudster's trying to pass you account information, induce you to make a payment. So there's kind of behavioral anomalies that you can pick up on, maybe discrete and minute, but they're very powerful in how they deviate from your normal usage patterns. And then beyond that, there's the risks that are inherent in any online activity. We hear all days about malware, infected machines, remote access attempts. From a Trojan perspective, that could be a backdoor that's completely unknown to the user. So these sorts of things equally add value and protections in that we are layering on top of this identity structure. I'm confident it's Dan. But is there anything that moves that narrative away from the level of trust I should pair to this identity attestation? Actually, is there a risk here in the session? Is there a risk here in the application? Is there a risk here from a social engineering and a behavioral aspect as well?
So I guess what we're doing, Stuart, is saying that we need to evolve from the traditional ways of thinking with these data signals, which is let's use it as positive affirmation that this is Stuart. Perhaps let's authenticate him via device possession or behavioral inheritance and kind of connect it to that SCA umbrella. Flip side is the device is not Stuart's regular device. The behaviorals look significantly out of kilter with what we normally expect to see from Stuart. But in a world of APP, what you're saying is the line actually gets blurred between those two things. So is there a layer in the middle that says, well, we think based on the device and the way in which the logins happened and perhaps the way in which the device is positioned from a location perspective, this is Stuart's confirmed identity. But there's a bunch of things that he's doing that are not necessarily hugely abnormal in terms of the level of abstraction from what he normally does, but the fact there are a few things in here that perhaps tell me that he's under duress from somebody and he's being asked to do something, so he's perhaps hesitating, or he's sitting on this particular part of the page for much longer than he normally does. Is that the direction that you see it going?
Yeah, and equally, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if we talked about point solutions, there's maybe examples in the industry where entities are more comfortable putting controls in place at points in time, at transactional points. I want to protect my front door. I want to protect my payment. But these risks can emerge in the journey at any point. So actually, I think, the strongest control is having that continuous insight, continuous risk assessment, continuous prodding, and looking at the overall information as it flows in real time from a behavioral assessment and from a risk assessment to make sure that you're picking up on any of these, and they can be quite discrete things that might happen. That obviously also plays into the fact that many frauds have maybe more longitudinal approaches, right? So I might not go in and attempt the fraud immediately. I might start doing some, social engineering
A
tactics.
romance scam, for example.
Yeah, that have an element of, a long time period. There's this courtship. There's this emotional kind of investment over time and this inbuilt relationship. And those things don't necessarily, emanate with a fraud that happens overnight. It's something that, the biggest success of those types of attempts is the fact that most people go after the fact, why did I do that? But it's because emotionally you've been so invested, so much time and effort has been put into that particular fraud MO, curating it by the fraudster, that has been so successful.
One thing I did want to flip back to and perhaps just get your perspective on, and it's quite a broad question, but you mentioned a couple of times the fact that devices are starting to look more similar at the operating system level, and it's going to become harder to differentiate and create a unique fingerprint, etc. Just how bound are tools like device and behavior? Just how bound and controlled are they by the Googles and the Apples of this world, with the Chrome browser and with the iOS operating system? Are they really the ones that have got the ultimate control around what vendors like FeedsEye can get from a device? And what's the dynamic there? Is that a big risk going forward? Is it something that there's always going to be agreement that we can work around because of the purpose of the data collection? I'm very curious just to get kind of your perspective on that big take.
Again, going back to my point earlier, what we've seen has been a pattern of privacy controls being put into place by operating systems and by browser vendors. Does that cause a huge concern going forwards? No, I think, as I mentioned, for every new privacy measure put in place, there is an academic paper explaining how that can be advantageously exploited, right? Either in bad ways or in good ways. How does that evolve in the overall weight you maybe apply to a device based upon the context of what sorts of devices you see? So, for example, Chrome as a vendor has had a huge privacy sandbox program that's created a lot of movements in the industry, most notably in advertising, because there's been this kind of conflation of advertising revenue needs from, different parties and how this might impact them. Everyone's heard about third-party cookie deprecation and the end of advertising revenue. Well, actually, some of that's been reversed. So whilst we talk about there's threats to this, there's also this kind of back and forth. There's a lot of tension in the market between what's happening with device tracking and advertising. But like I said, 10 years ago, people were exploiting the fact that people had Java installed in their device. You could not, or Flash installed. These are things you can no longer grab. But does it mean that there are not new and novel mechanisms to get the same amount of uniquely identifying information? No, there is. It just requires more R&D. It requires more concerted efforts by vendors to find the value therein. And then going back to my point about behaviors, I think even in a world where there is this convergence of, okay, I can't necessarily identify a device completely uniquely against maybe a population of 100 people because everyone's got the latest iPhone and everyone probably has default settings. There are ways above and beyond browser APIs that allow vendors to equally identify that device uniquely. They don't necessarily have to rely on those APIs. They are an important vector. They're an evolving vector. They require continuous R&D, but there are other methods. And again, I would never put your eggs in one basket. I would never say go down the road of just, relying on device. Equally, I'd never go down the road of saying just rely upon behavior. Back to your point, it's about the convergence of these signals. It's about the weighted value of aggregating them all that's going to be significant to identify a person online, to build trust, and to stop fraud.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. That's fascinating context. And one thing that occurred to me as you were talking there is, there's a bunch of vendors on the market that are providing these kind of capabilities. And one of the other kind of, I guess, broader trends that I wouldn't necessarily say we're seeing in the market, but certainly banks are starting to talk about it, is how do I build my own machine learning models to crunch the transactional data of an event, and create an outcome on that. How do you position your team? Because I guess one thing I perhaps underestimated before we had this discussion was actually a whole bunch of the engineering effort and the technical effort is still needs to remain on the kind of core of the product, which is how do I make sure my device continues to be robust? So as well as getting attracted towards these kind of triangles of device behavior and behavior analytics, and attracted to the authentication mechanisms and the active calls and all these additional things, maintaining that kind of core of the product seems hugely important. Is that an observation you share, and how do you set your team up to succeed with that context in mind, I guess?
If you look at it from the customer point of view, as you've mentioned, a lot of customers are getting more confident in building their own models, modeling it against the data they have. The biggest difference and the most discrete difference with the signals we've been talking about, device, behavior, risk, is that requires continuous R&D. That requires understanding how a web standard change impacts a particular device attribute. We've seen that in the past, right? Chrome decided to freeze user agent strings a couple of years ago. That meant that all of a sudden all Chrome browsers looked like the same version, right? How do you mitigate against that? Well, there's other standards you can use to identify a particular browser or user agent. Equally, there's a huge amount of external academic research into these areas. There's a huge amount of internal research you can do. A lot of these things are the fringes or the frontiers of kind of exploit. So it's understanding, how do I leverage based upon some of these constructs? How do I gather new signals? How do I discover new signals? Equally, at the same time, fraudsters are doing the same. They're prodding, they're figuring out new ways and mechanisms to commit fraud. So whilst you're doing your own internal research into like the identity problem, they're doing their own research into how to commit fraud. And you need to be aware of that. And that can be through intelligence. So, actually having stronger connections with, for example, security engineering, security groups, intelligence feeds can give you some indication, can give you a little peephole into some of the fraudster techniques that are emerging. Some of these are harder to find, like they might be dark web communities. Some of these are actually fairly public. You'll find them on a Discord server, but the techniques you can apply to scraping a website to gather content, something that's actually pretty prevalent these days given ChatGPT and all these open AI crawlers, and we're talking about agentic AI and all these sorts of concepts. Some of those techniques equally apply to fraudsters who want to automate and commit fraud. So equally having an insight from a research perspective into the research or the R&D industry of fraud is important, and that involves intelligence. But having that R&D embedded equally to look at how are the standards, particularly technical standards, changing in the industry, and how does that affect some of my product line? Those are the two arms of your R&D. That is kind of what is embedded in that problem area, and that's where we spend a lot of time.
We often talk about fraud being adversarial, but we think of it being adversarial between the bank and the fraudster. As soon as the bank puts in a control, the fraudster is likely to change, right? But I guess what you're saying, Stuart, from a build perspective, it's also kind of adversarial with the big tech providers as well, right? If you're not monitoring what they're planning to change and what their outlook looks like, then you're going to fall behind in terms of not just the collection of the signals, but the mechanism and usage of those signals as well.
Yeah, totally. And, these things are not always obvious to foresee. I always come into this with the best solutions have a kind of spread bet approach. You've got a multitude of different techniques. You're looking at the widest possible data set. And as a result, you're undoubtedly going to have the best overall outcome. That's going to be either from a performance perspective or the speed to react to change in the market that comes during unforeseen events.
So as we see this convergence, Stu, of capabilities coming together, and we discuss the impact of what that might mean for the bank in terms of if they've got the value from one of those particular feeds decreasing, but perhaps the commercial cost is increasing. How do they address that? And they're often thinking about that from a kind of P&L and a dollar perspective. But how do they ensure that what they do doesn't create an unnecessary impact on the consumer? So I guess there's the ROI conversation, but there's also the user experience conversation as well. Things like device are often used not just for fraud prevention as a risk signal, but also as a positive affirmation of identity. So we need to be considerate of both sides of the coin, right, as we start to think about this consolidation conversation.
Yeah, obviously, from a consolidation perspective, if you're it's within the bank's gift if they're reducing overall cost, they can pass some of that cost or that profit benefit down onto the consumer. Um, that aside, I think the biggest advantage to the consumer of this is the banks are optimizing for outcomes. So the outcome can be less fraud, in which case there is less detriment to the end customer. There's fewer customers who are victims of fraud. But equally, as you said, you can optimize for user experience. And actually, with the convergence of signals, you can have trade-offs of both, which work and are optimal to achieve both goals. And as most people know, the less intrusion there is into the actual user experience, the better the outcome. And that's especially true in, say, card payments and rails, where we know the more and more interventions, the more blocks are put in place from the user experience perspective, causes less conversions of a shopping cart, for example, causes less payments, less throughput of actual monetary transactions. So that's kind of paramount as well from a user experience perspective.
So just jumping back to your point around regulation, Stuart, in particularly the regulation that is applied to the big tech arena, it seems to me, and I welcome your thoughts on whether my observation is valid or needs to be challenged, but it seems like you've got various pockets of regulation going on. So you've got the banking regulation, you've got the big tech regulation, you've got regulation around telco operators, but it doesn't seem like these three things are in any way connected. And perhaps to me, there's an observation that suggests if there was think of those three as a Venn and put the consumer benefit at the middle, there might be benefit in kind of interaction between these various forms of regulation to ensure that we are making a collective step forward rather than making decisions which can have unintended consequences down the line.
In an ideal world, I think we would have some overarching, thematic body that looks at this purely from a customer orientated point of view. That's very hard. Even trying to move a regulatory change in the industry of a industry requires a lot of participants. Sometimes, too many cooks is a challenge. I do think there's an argument for wider participation, particularly of fraud experts, fraud prevention practitioners into those regulatory bodies to be the vocal spokesperson for how some of that regulation impacts some of the things they're trying to do to protect the consumer. Putting in more privacy controls can benefit the consumer, can also create challenges for fraud detection. That's buried away in like a repo of conversations between developers, essentially. And actually, I think some of that could be highlighted more prominent in the wider decision making that happens across regulatory bodies.
That's a really good observation, Stuart. And I spent some time in the APAC region in the last couple of weeks, and one thing that struck me from my time, particularly in Singapore, is the desire for regulator and bank to work as a collective. And I found that there was a mutual respect between those two bodies as a result of that open engagement. Certainly, whereas in other parts of the world, it's adversarial is probably a strong term, but we say and then you do, and there isn't that practitioner overlap to determine, well, why are we doing this? Are we going to achieve the outcome that we want? Are we going to produce a whole bunch of unintended consequences as a result? And I think we're starting to see, particularly in that part of the world, that model become more frequently adopted. It's relatively immature in terms of some of the things they've put forward as a result of that collective brain power coming together, but it'd be really interesting to see how it unfolds as we kind of move through the rest of this year.
For sure, and I think going forwards, there's a strong reason to have equally retrospectives and all these things, right? We go into regulation with an intended outcome. Tracking that intended outcome can sometimes be weaker than would be, best to advantageously move, find out the things that worked, the things that didn't work, and reach the best overall outcome.
Stuart, it's been an absolute pleasure having you join me. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan.